my master's topic, specifically how I constructed my master's, what the key results I found, discussion points and points I want to take into my advocacy and action research, and the core elements I'd like you to consider when discussing this topic and when working in the various areas with which you work in. We don't need to introduce me. I think
No. She's looking expectantly for the solution.
I can keep going. But
Yeah, keep going, Amy.
We'll catch up.
Can we do it here?
So I came to this research topic and my desire to understand the
Just wait, if you
essentially
could just wait till the
what
next slide.
and how people understand the idea of seeking treatment and cures in a New Zealand context. So these are the core elements that I was really interested in when I started to form my research topic. It was a long and slow process. I don't mind confessing to you that in a lot of ways, I was looking for something of an enemy, like I wanted to see what I could actually get, and I wanted to see what I could really work against in this whole space. Because in a lot of ways, the way I work and the way I embedded my life as a person who lived with a disability, there is a lot of struggle and a lot of tension around people spending vast amounts of money on prospective cures. So I've always been interested in this space. I've always seen this space in action, and I've also seen a lot of the narratives, which made it interesting, and how I came up and how I constructed the ideas of how do people understand the idea of seeking treatment, cure, and management in the context of broader neoliberal and healthist ideas. So the idea of within the context of how we live now, how are people making sense of what it means to live with a chronic condition and what it means to be expected to manage this condition. My methodology was divided into two sections. So I did an online content review purely based on the logic that online content is becoming increasingly popular and increasingly predominant in how people seek their own knowledge about their health, how they understand a sense of community around their condition, and also to a lesser or greater extent, it's a democratizer in the sense of people can access the same information. So I divided my online content into these key sort of topic areas around official government websites, such as hospital websites or the Ministry of Health, the patient resources, the media constructions of cure narratives and health, and lastly, the content that was based on the experimental treatment and cure website, so the direct-to-consumer marketing. And because I had Jenny Brown as a supervisor, she wasn't going to let me get away with just doing that as my thesis, sadly. So instead of getting people to review the documents and to give me their opinion on the online content, which was my original intention, I wanted to get a sense of how people make sense of the seeking cure narrative. So the idea of seeking treatment, seeking management. So I constructed a vignette study where I constructed 4 possible hypothetical scenarios around where people were at different points of their health experience. So a couple were seeking experimental treatment and a couple were living in what I constructed as the regular conventional health system pathway. And it was through the vignette experience and through the vignette analysis, I was really able to get a sense of how people construct and how people make sense of not only the sense of a cure, but how they make sense of the patients themselves and how they make sense of hypothetical fictionalized New Zealanders who live with chronic and complex conditions. And I don't mind telling you, it was confronting and difficult seeing how people made sense of these hypothetical fictionalized people. I felt very defensive of my characters when some of the language was being constructed around them as people. And so I did my analytic process using reflective thematic analysis, which is a general term for a collection of tools around where you embed yourself in the reflective process and you do a number of coding iterations. I hate coding software with a deep and abiding passion. So I was a post-it note and glue stick girl all the way. So I was a very manual coder, but I also used Miro and some of the online whiteboarding. And this very much helped me to construct and understand and get a real physical sense of the analytic process. And it worked very much for me, but it was a slow and methodical process. And I went through like about 27 iterations of my final coding list, which Jenny assured me may not be normal, but it's on the pathway to acceptable, which was my entire thesis journey, really. So a note on definition before I start talking about my analytic chapters. That I had 4 main things that were the bedrock of my thesis. So the bedrock of the definitions, and they became the bedrock of my writing process and the development of the analytical chapters. First is the underlying assumption of healthism, which is Robert Crawford's sociological term, which essentially means that the responsibility for health is placed on the individual, and therefore it allows the retreating of the state. So the individual is expected to embody the health values and become a healthy citizen for the good of the individual, for the good of the state, and for the good of their societal roles. Secondly, as a general concept, I talked about chronicity, or the experience of chronicity. So by which I mean the experience of a long-term condition, but I quite consciously in my survey and quite consciously in my thesis did not define chronicity itself, mainly because there's no reliable definition for having a chronic condition. There's a clinical definition which medical professionals use, but there isn't a everyday definition. And furthermore, I wanted my participants to come to it with their own understanding of what they mean by chronicity and their own understanding of being embedded in the healthcare system. As a general rule, I constructed it around the idea that people were living with a condition that required intervention across a period of time. And the two core concepts that came out of my analysis and came through my analysis, I constructed as the term a hostile ecosite for the ability for how people with chronic conditions are expected to navigate the system. I reflected it as being very hostile to the idea of chronicity. So I extended the metaphor of ecosystem, which is the health ecosystem within which we all live, which could have neoliberal undertones, to the idea that there's no safe space for people with chronic conditions to just sit and be, even if they don't drain the health system or do any kind of things that a lot of the participants talked about, they were still expected to try and move towards a sense of curative at pretty much all cost. So chronicity as a hostile ecosite. So the idea that chronicity isn't acceptable as a general state. And I reflected on earlier in this talk that I started with a real interest in cure narratives, But I realized that it wasn't the cure narratives that were in play. Curing and seeking a cure is merely a wider system of how people construct and how people understand the idea of living with a chronic condition. And there's very much this notion that it's detrimental to the self. And some of the key things that came through my research and through the reflections of the participants were very much around a sense of a loss of self, a sense of their identity as a role in their role, particularly when it came to masculine parenting and feminine parenting, traditional roles of mother and father very much came through, particularly in the fictionalized scenarios, and very much the construct that it's not acceptable to live with a chronic condition. And the natural extension of that is, if it's not acceptable to live with a chronic condition, why wouldn't you do everything possible to change that state? Yeah, and there was very much a demarcation in how people constructed the idea of living with a condition around the idea that the body should be controllable. You should have a body that's reliable, fit, and well, and that there are systemic places in which you can enact the body and make the body well. And also that you have a right to seek 100% control, 100% the ability to not only control your body, but also control every decision that you make within the healthcare space. And I just wanted to highlight this quote that came from my online content analysis as just around how a particular person viewed their experience of living with a disability. And I should point out here that I very consciously stayed away from talking about specific cures or specific treatment because I wasn't necessarily interested in how individuals seek XYZ treatment for MS, for example. It was more a matter of the wider chronicity and curative narrative. I'm a huge proponent and always have been of people seeking whatever works for them, but it's the wider curative narrative that becomes problematic. And the wider notion that living with a disability, living with a chronic condition is completely unacceptable. So therefore, any risk that's taken, including death, is acceptable. And this naturally became my second analytic chapter, the idea that normalcy is the ultimate pride. If you can and you should do everything possible to seek a betterment for yourself, for the sake of yourself, for the sake of your role, and the sake of society as a whole. And it became increasingly important for people who have short treatment, to not only to get better, but do what I termed the notion of performative normality. So the ability to not only clinically show that you're better, but to perform an act of being better. So the classic example is the idea of you start out in a wheelchair and then you're walking, or you start out walking, but then you run a marathon. So there's a performative element to proving that you're better. And there was very much the idea that people had the absolute right to control their health, but also they needed to be qualified. One of the things that I did to challenge people somewhat, and I'm still ambivalent about this analytic choice, is that one of my vignette scenarios had what I called a mild intellectual impairment, and the amount of responses I got about his perceived lack of executive functioning and his perceived failure when it comes to navigating the health system was quite shocking, in the sense that I hadn't made any judgment in the vignette about how bad it was, but there was very much that was very much reflected back at me. So it's again, it comes down to the idea that chronicity is unacceptable. Therefore, people need to work very, very hard to escape that state, but you can only do that if you're qualified, by which people mean not having an intellectual impairment. And again, these are a few samples of some of the discussion points and some of how people made sense of the narrative experiences of mainly people in the vignette study. So the idea, and it's very much the idea was championed, that cure, a quest for cure or a request for performing the idea of cure is almost worth it at any cost, including financial, psychological, and physical. Now, I got to the very cool stage of a lot of people I know, they finish their thesis and they're like, I never want to see that again. I want to hold a ceremonial bonfire to get rid of all the evidence. I felt rather strange and embarrassed to admit that I still quite like my thesis and are keen to start doing some action points and start discussing some of the points. So I felt like a bit of an oddity. But with that in mind, the next couple of slides are going to talk about some of the key elements that I want to explore further in my work and for bringing together some of the constructions of what it means to live with a chronic condition and ultimately how do we create a space for chronicity. And one of the first things that really struck me is how people construct the New Zealand experience. Like we all know the New Zealand health system has its flaws and will continue to develop its flaws under the current government. But there was very much a centralizing of the privileging of the overseas knowledge experience. So the clinics in Norway, the clinics in Mexico, the clinics in every other northern hemisphere or southern hemisphere country you could practically name that wasn't New Zealand had all the answers, and therefore people had every right to mortgage their houses for the sake of that knowledge. New Zealand knowledge wasn't seen as ideal or worth it in the long run, particularly when it came to the idea of the very loose idea of innovation. So in a sense, I want to get a sense of how people are understanding their own country, because this is very real to me in the sense of I know people who are mortgaging their houses to go to Mexico for stem cells, for example, and how people are centralizing this knowledge. And this comes to the next stage. I think that there's a curious tension when we talk about responsibilization, because every leaflet you get in the health system now talks about patient empowerment. We must empower the patient to do X, Y, Z, stand on their heads, dance on a pinhead, or whatever. But for me, responsibilization and empowerment are kind of two sides to the same coin. And I'm very reluctant to use the term empowerment because it very much means it's your responsibility, it's not my responsibility. And if you screw this up, then you screw this up, and everything is hunky-dory for me. So in a sense, I want to broaden the idea that it's all very well to say doctors and patients work in partnership, but there needs to be an equal meeting of the partnership. Like I often say, if I'm in the emergency room with pneumonia, I don't want to be asked what my patient preferences are. I just want prednisone to deal with my pneumonia. Like it's about bringing together the two sides of knowledge, and as the wonderful Deborah Lupin say, we have dethroned medical professionalism as the only source of knowledge, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't roles for other sources of knowledge to bedrock your own experience. Now, when you're in critical health spaces like this, and when you have Jenny Brown as a supervisor, you better get used to the idea of critiquing normality as something that doesn't exist. But the fundamental thing, and the thing that came through, for example, I coded during my initial coding round. I had about 600 codes, and 200 of them related to being normal or normality or normal in some way. Normal is a very, very attractive thing to a lot of people still. And we need to sort of confront it directly rather than just saying there's no such thing as normal, because there very much is in the public consciousness. It very much takes light, it very much takes fire, and people adore. Like the Vitruvian Man did nobody with disabilities any favors, because it very much created that sense of ideal self, that ideal man, and we're very much still beholden to that idea of normality, and it needs to be seen in the light when you're very much discussing with people what they mean by I just want to be back to normal, or I just want to experience being normal. Because people who live with people who had acquired conditions said I wanted to go back to being normal. And the people that live with chronic conditions said I want to experience being normal or conditions from birth. So it's very much something that the two constructions of disabilities have in common. And one of the things that I explored and I started to explore in my discussion chapters was the idea of curative violence, which is a term coined by a South Korean academic to talk about and to underscore the idea that people living with chronic conditions and disabilities can only access state care, can only be worthy of care and consideration if they are proving that they are working towards a curative end. She framed this specifically around the extreme preoccupation in South Korea with stem cell treatment and the ability to get famous, usually male stars, back from paralysis. She framed it around that any sacrifice, anything that you take away from yourself in terms of finances, in terms of psychology, in terms of physical health, is worth it because you are serving the state. And she said curative violence can very much come into play in a lot of areas quite subtly and quite without measurement or subject, because curing something is inherently seen as a good thing. And you can have a cure without the curative narratives around it. And the classic example that I referenced in my thesis was the idea of cosmetic limb lengthening, because that isn't seen as medically necessary, but it's very much a curative violence from the unacceptable thing of being a short-statured person. So it very much creates a tension. And we're talking about in sickness and health, the idea of being both living with a chronic condition, and we need to also be careful in how we construct the idea of chronicity and disability having an automatically connected relationship. You can be chronically ill with disabling, and that can lead to disabling elements. You can have a chronic condition without disabling elements, and vice versa. You can live with a disability without being ill, or you can live with a disability and be ill. They're quite distinct concepts, but they get very much lumped in together. So, as an ultimate summary of this presentation, I'd like to say, can we present a space to live with chronicity without curative narratives, and working towards challenging the idea of healthism, particularly for the people that don't necessarily fit into the broader overtones of wellness culture and the idea that we can all be healthy if we get up at 4 a.m., do yoga with goats, and drink 27 liters of water. So thank you very much. and I'm happy to take questions. We have time.